It's okay. It's okay, Jimmy.
We are talking Salem Witch Doll, directed and written by Daniel Yates. Now, it's produced by Louisa Warren, I've actually reviewed a few of her films, and also Tyler James. Now, I suspect Tyler James is actually a pseudonym for one of these two individuals, either Scott Jeffrey, aka Scott Chambers, or Reese Wake-Waterfield, the director of Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey. Anyway, there is many low-budget British horror films that seem to hit the market. This is yet another one. And the story of this one is a family reunion. And we have this young girl who is suffering a bit mentally because the death of her mother. And there's a kind of like a family sort of get together for one of the kind of like the people's birthdays. And, we've got aunts, uncles, cousins, and things like that. And also what the father of this, our main character, is getting engaged to this new woman, which is causing problems for our lead. But there seems to be some type of killer shenanigans going on, possibly linked to a large human-sized sort of golem wooden doll sort of creature. And also witchcraft may be involved. What'll happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So, very low budget movie. Quite a talky movie. Let's discuss what I think does work in this film. Now, the acting is mixed. Let me start by saying that. But within that mix, I do think there are a couple of either good to okay performances. So the good. So there's actually a couple of the younger actors here who kind of act like siblings, and their kind of banter, their back and forth, the language there, I actually do think is quite conducive of like a sort of sibling rivalry or that sort of rough and tumble kind of relationship that some siblings have. So I actually thought their acting was relatively strong. And there are other actors who I think do at least an okay job, including our main character, who I think for the most part does a fairly good job. There's a few kind of down points in the third act, I would say, but for the most part, I think the performance is at least fairly good for this kind of level of movie. So the acting, there's some kind of like performances what I do think have some merit. I think the cinematography here is a little bit dark overall, but it does give this English kind of countryside aesthetic some sort of misty, ethereal qualities that kind of go hand in hand with this sort of old-timey kind of witch aesthetic that the movie kind of does as well. Our kind of puppet creature, I guess, is a physical suit, which does not too bad. I think ultimately we don't see a huge amount of it, but I think the actual prop itself doesn't look kind of too bad. It's an interesting where it's not necessarily purely kind of wood. I won't go too much into the details here, but I think there's an interesting mechanics in regards to the idea, but kind of behind that. And then also incorporating this kind of witchcraft angle. I don't really know why we had to include like Salem witchcraft exactly. But this being a British movie, England has its own history with kind of witchcraft. I guess this is a sort of thing to try and, make it appeal to American audiences. But it seemed like an unnecessary inclusion to a large degree, because there's one character here who's got an American accent. I don't think she's actually American, but I'm assuming this is meant to be so it can be sold abroad. The storyline, it's somewhat kind of workmanlike, but it's not bad, I would say. What doesn't work? You may feel I'm kind of being a little skirting around with my praise here. whilst I don't think this is a terrible film, ultimately its biggest sin is that it's quite dull. It's a very talky film with, and let me be kind and said, mixed performances. Some of the dialogue seems somewhat kind of clunky. The relationships between our characters seem a little forced at times, I have to say. And the general kind of forward momentum of the plot is very plodding, very kind of slow, relatively kind of obvious about the kind of what's kind of going on here. And I have to say, the way our main character is portrayed, she's meant to have this kind of trauma, and I kind of get where they were going with that. But I don't know if she comes across as particularly kind of likable. So the plot is very plodding, as I mentioned, and really the first 2/3 of this movie is mostly just kind of family drama, with those kind of other elements that, as I say, make up for a somewhat of a unthrilling ride. You know, clunky dialogue, not great acting, kind of dull cinematography. And then we get to the third act where the kind of the majority of this kind of plot actually kind of happens. The wooden sort of doll character is really not the main issue here, to be honest, and is more of just a kind of a tool that someone else uses, and as such is not as interesting as potentially it could be. And we have seen sort of killer mannequin type movies before, and I think that may have been a more interesting route that this movie could have taken. And the kind of the witchcraft stuff is just a little bit sort of, it's lots of telling you things, basically. And it's, well, I don't know if it's that interesting, visually speaking, if I'm completely honest with you. So the movie, I wouldn't say is necessarily a bad film, but it's just not particularly interesting. There are some elements that I do think dip it in a kind of a negative manner, but it's very sort of just kind of workmanlike and sort of somewhat lackluster. And I said this before in a few reviews, sometimes you're almost better having a bad movie that is just like kind of like out there and entertaining rather than a movie which ends up being sort of like dirty dishwater. And that's kind of what I feel this movie's like. It's probably not going to kill you if you were to drink it, but it's not going to taste good, and it's kind of gross and kind of dull and sort of, you know, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I won't say this is a terrible movie necessarily, but it's not a good movie in any respects. Workmanlike, lackluster, below average. I want to give this one a 3 out of 10. Have you seen it? What do you think? Leave me a comment, and I shall look forward to seeing you next time.